Now I'll write the story with completely new names not on that list. I'll use Marion, narrator, 63. Brett. Wait, Brett is on the list. Let me choose Marion. Narrator, Scott. Son, Heather. Daughter-in-law, Gil. Late husband, Ruthann. Narrator's friend. Let me verify. Marion. Cot. Heather. Cot. Gil. Ruthann. None on the list. I want to tell you something I've never said out loud before. Not to my pastor, not to my oldest friend, not even to myself for a long time. Because saying it out loud means admitting that the worst night of my life happened inside a house I helped buy, standing on the back patio with a glass of sparkling water while my son laughed with his friends 15 feet away and never once looked up to find me. Let me back up. Let me go back to the beginning, because the ending doesn't make sense without it. My name is Marion. I'm 63 years old. I taught 4th grade for 27 years, and I raised my son Scott by myself from the time he was 9 years old. His father, my husband Gil, died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning. Just like that. No warning, no goodbye, no chance to prepare for the version of life that was about to start. One Tuesday, Gil was scrambling eggs at the kitchen counter, and by Thursday, I was standing at a funeral home, trying to explain to a 9-year-old boy that his father wasn't coming home. I want you to understand what those years were like. Not for sympathy. I didn't want sympathy then, and I don't want it now. But I need you to understand so that what comes later makes sense. I taught school during the day and graded papers after Scott went to bed. In the summers, I tutored. On weekends, I did the grocery shopping, the yard work, the car maintenance, the plumbing when I could manage it, the hardware store runs, the dentist appointments, the parent-teacher conferences where I sat on both sides of the table. I didn't date. I told myself it was because Scott needed stability. That was partly true. The other part was that I was so tired, so completely hollowed out by 10 o'clock every night, that I couldn't imagine summoning the energy to be interesting to another person. What I had, and I held onto it with both hands, was Scott. He was a quiet kid, serious, good at math in the way that made his teachers write notes home saying he's something special. He grew up into a serious young man, went to college on a partial scholarship and loans. I helped as much as I could, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, money I had set aside from tutoring. After he graduated, he landed a job at an engineering firm in Columbus, and within a few years he was doing very well. Not wealthy, but comfortable. The kind of comfortable that takes the edge off everything. I was proud of him. That pride was the purest thing I had. When he called to tell me about Heather, I remember I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold next to me. He sounded happy in a way I hadn't heard from him in a long time. Lighter somehow. Like something had been quietly bothering him for years and had finally been resolved. I liked her immediately when we met for dinner that first time. She was smart and funny and clearly loved him. She had a close relationship with her own mother, which I noticed and thought was a good sign. They got engaged 2 years later. Spring wedding, somewhere nice. I was over the moon. Then things started shifting in ways so small I told myself I was imagining them. Heather's family was well off. Her father was in commercial real estate. Her mother had done something in finance before retiring. They had a beautiful home in a suburb outside Cincinnati, the kind of house that has a wine cellar and a room just for wrapping Christmas presents. I don't say this bitterly. It's just fact. And I think somewhere in that fact was the beginning of what happened. I started to notice that when the 4 of us were together, Scott and Heather, her parents and me, the conversation flowed easily in one direction. Her parents talked about their house, their trips, their circle of friends. Scott listened and contributed. I sat and smiled and answered when I was directly asked a question, which happened less and less. I noticed that Scott had started describing me differently to people. It was subtle. He used to say, "My mom taught elementary school." He started saying, "She used to be a teacher," past tense, which was accurate since I'd retired. But the used to be carried something in it, a slight distance, a polite redaction. I told myself I was too sensitive. I was reading into things. This happens. Children grow up. They build new lives. Priorities reorganize. That's normal. That's supposed to happen. What wasn't supposed to happen 14 months before the wedding, On a Sunday afternoon when Scott came to visit alone and we sat at the same kitchen table where I'd heard about Heather for the first time. He wanted to talk about the house. He and Heather had found a place they loved. A new construction in a development about 20 minutes outside Columbus. 4 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, a backyard big enough for the future they were planning. The price was more than they could manage with just their savings, even combined. They needed help with the down payment. $80,000. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because I'd spent a long time examining it. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel used. What I felt was needed, and I am not proud of how good that felt. After years of watching my son move into a life that seemed to have less and less room for me, here he was sitting at my table asking for my help, needing me in a concrete, practical, undeniable way. I had the money. I had been careful my whole life, careful with spending, careful with saving, methodical in a way that some people find depressing, but that I found comforting. My retirement account was intact. I had a separate savings account I'd been adding to for years, just in case. The just in case fund sat at $91,000. I said yes. I said yes without asking for anything in return. No repayment plan, no paperwork, no conditions. I wrote a check for $80,000 and I handed it to my son. I want to say I did it freely and without expectation. That would be the noble version. The honest version is that I genuinely believed that this act would mean something, that it would change the texture of things, that it would remind Scott in some way that I was his mother and I was here and what existed between us was worth more than Sunday calls that lasted 11 minutes. I moved into a 1-bedroom rental apartment the following month. The apartment was fine, clean, quiet, good light in the mornings. I told myself I was simplifying. I told myself that's what you do at this stage of life. You let go of excess. You travel lighter. I made the apartment feel like home. I hung my pictures. I bought a new reading chair. I kept the window boxes full of petunias every summer. But I knew the truth, even if I didn't say it. I had given my son the house and I was renting a room. The wedding planning started immediately after the engagement and it was Heather's mother's project from the beginning. I don't begrudge her that. It was her daughter's wedding and she was paying the majority of it. She had opinions and energy and a vision board. I had been invited to exactly one planning meeting, a brunch at a cafe where decisions had clearly already been made and I was there to be informed rather than consulted. I said the centerpieces sounded beautiful and ate my eggs. Benedict and drove home. What I was not prepared for was the housewarming party. That sounds like a small thing compared to the wedding, I know. But the housewarming party is where I understood, for the first time, exactly what my place was in my son's new life. They hosted it about 4 months after they moved in. Their house was beautiful. I want to say that because it was. High ceilings, new floors, a kitchen that opened into the living space in the way that all houses seem to have now. Heather had decorated it warmly and well. They'd had about 40 people there, colleagues of Scott's and Heather's, her college friends, her family. I arrived at the time I was told. I had baked 24 lemon bars because I know Scott loves lemon bars, and I thought it would be a nice thing. I handed them to Heather at the door. She thanked me and set them on the kitchen counter and turned to greet the couple behind me. For the first hour, I circulated. I talked to people I'd never met and would likely never see again. I smiled and said I was Scott's mother and watched that fact register on people's faces the way it registers when the information is slightly surprising or simply not relevant. At some point, the crowd thickened and I couldn't find Scott, so I stepped outside onto the back patio to get some air. Heather's parents were on the patio too, at the center of a cluster of people, telling a story that was making everyone laugh. Her father had a commanding kind of presence, the sort that makes people want to stand closer. Her mother caught my eye and gave me a small wave and then looked back at her husband. I stood near the garden bed with my club soda and I thought, I paid for this patio, not proudly, not as a claim, just as a fact that was sitting there in my chest with no particular place to go. Scott came outside about 20 minutes later. He was with 3 friends talking about something that involved a lot of laughter. He saw me and lifted his chin, the brief chin lift of acknowledgement, the gesture you'd give an acquaintance you're too busy to speak to. Then he turned back to his friends. I went home early. I told Heather I had a slight headache. She said she hoped I felt better soon and hugged me quickly, and that was that. In the car, I kept very still. I drove carefully. I did not let myself think about what had just happened until I was inside my apartment with the door closed. And then I sat in my reading chair, and I thought about it very clearly, maybe for the first time. My son was embarrassed by me. Not violently, not cruelly, not the way a teenager is embarrassed by a parent's dancing. Something quieter and more considered than that. I was not the kind of mother he wanted people to see. I was from a different world than the one he was building. A school teacher's world, a careful with money world, a world of lemon bars and secondhand furniture and no wine cellar. I was a reminder of where he started. And where he started was not where he wanted to stay. This is the part I've replayed the most, trying to figure out when exactly it became irreversible. I think it had been building for years, and I had just been too busy being needed to notice. 2 months before the wedding, Scott called to discuss the reception seating chart. He wanted to make sure I was comfortable with where I'd been placed. I was at table 11. There were 16 tables. Table 11 was near the back of the room, tucked close to the service entrance. My table mates were Heather's great-aunt, who had significant hearing difficulties, a colleague of Scott's who had been invited as a courtesy, and 2 people I never did identify. It was a perfectly adequate table. It was also the table where you put people you fulfilled an obligation toward, but don't need to think about for the rest of the evening. I said it sounded fine. I was getting good at saying things sounded fine. The mother-son dance had been removed from the program. I found this out not from Scott, but from the wedding website, which I checked one evening when I was curious about the timeline. The dances listed were the first dance and the father-daughter dance. There was a note that said the evening will also feature special dedications during dinner. That was apparently where I was going to appear, as a special dedication, the audio equivalent of table 11. I called Scott. I asked, very calmly, whether there had been a decision about the mother-son dance. He said Heather had felt it might make things uneven since her own father was no longer living. He'd passed away 3 years prior. I said I understood. I said that made sense. I hung up the phone and sat with what I was actually feeling, which was that my son had chosen to erase a tradition that was mine, in order to spare his wife's family a momentary discomfort, and that he had not thought to call me and tell me directly. I found out from a website. I kept going. I bought a dress. A good one, deep blue, appropriate but not invisible. I got my hair done. I drove 3 hours to the venue the day before and checked into the small hotel down the road. I went to the rehearsal dinner, where I sat at the end of a table and contributed to conversations when I could, and watched my son move through the room like a man who had built something and was proud of it. I was proud of him too. That's what made everything so much harder. The wedding day was beautiful in the way that expensive, well-organized things are beautiful. Everything was in place. The ceremony was outdoors, the light was golden, Heather was genuinely lovely. I sat in the 3rd row, not the 1st, because Heather's mother and 2 aunts were in the 1st row, but 3rd was respectable. And I cried quietly when Scott took his vows. Those tears were real. The reception was where everything unraveled. I had found my table and set down my clutch and gone to find Scott to say hello. He was surrounded by people, but he saw me coming and he stepped slightly to the side in a way that I recognized. The way you step aside for someone you're about to briefly manage. He hugged me. He said I looked nice. Then one of his friends said something and Scott laughed and turned, and I was standing there on the edge of the group with nowhere to go. I went back to table 11. The evening progressed. The food was served. The speeches happened. Heather's maid of honor, Scott's best man, Heather's uncle who rambled warmly for 4 minutes. The special dedication was a sentence read by the MC. We'd also like to thank Scott's mother, Marion, for her love and support throughout the years. 1 sentence, read by a man who did not know me, into a microphone while people were reaching for their bread rolls. I did not look up. I looked at my plate. I pressed my thumb into the underside of the table, hard, and I breathed. Later in the evening, past the first dance, past the father-daughter dance, when the DJ had started playing and people had gotten looser and happier with wine, Scott found me. He seemed in good spirits. He sat down in the empty chair next to me and put his arm around my shoulders the way people do when they're feeling generous. He said, "You good, Mom? Having fun?" I looked at him. He had no idea. That was what got me. He genuinely had no idea that anything was wrong. He had placed me at table 11 and removed the mother-son dance and let the MC read my name like a footnote. And he sat there with his arm around me asking if I was having fun because as far as he could tell, he'd done everything right. I said, "Scott, can I ask you something?" He said, "Sure." I said, "Do you know how much I love you?" He smiled, a little uncertain now. "Of course, Mom." "Good," I said. "I need you to remember that. Because I need to tell you that tonight. The way tonight has gone, it's hurt me. And I don't want to ruin your wedding, so I'm going to leave quietly. But I want you to know." He started to say something. I could see him working through several responses simultaneously. Defense, dismissal, guilt, more defense. What came out was, "Mom, you're being a little dramatic." I took my hand off the table. I picked up my clutch. I stood up. He said, "Mom, come on, don't do this." I said, "I'm not doing anything. I'm going back to my hotel. I love you, Scott. Congratulations." I kissed him on the cheek. He didn't stop me. And I walked through that beautiful, expensive reception toward the door and out into the night air. And I stood in the parking lot for a moment and I let myself feel the whole weight of it. The $80,000, the lemon bars, the chin lift, the special dedication, the table near the service entrance, all of it. And then I drove to my hotel. I did not call him the next day, or the day after that. I made a decision, which was that I was going to stop pursuing a relationship that was slowly teaching me that I did not matter, not out of anger, not to punish him, because I was 61 years old and I had spent 30 years putting myself last and I was not going to spend whatever years I had left doing the same thing. He called 3 days later. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that said he was sorry if things felt off. If things felt off. I listened to it twice and deleted it. He called again 2 weeks later. I answered that time. We talked for a while, surface things, careful things, the kind of conversation where both people are aware they are navigating something but neither wants to name it directly. He said he wished I hadn't left early. I said I had been glad I did. There was a long pause. We said goodbye. We talked occasionally after that, civil, careful. Not the kind of talking that means anything. What changed things, what changed everything, was a phone call I got on a February morning about 18 months after the wedding. It was Heather. She called from the hospital. Scott had collapsed at work. Something with his heart, they thought. Stress-related, they weren't sure yet. Not a heart attack, but close enough that they had needed to run tests and keep him overnight. She was scared. Her voice was very thin. I was in my car within 20 minutes. I drove those 3 hours in a particular kind of silence. I thought about Gil, about that Tuesday morning, about how fast everything can rearrange itself. I thought about Scott, at 9 years old, standing at the graveside in a suit that was slightly too big for him. I thought about all the years of scrambled eggs and math homework and late nights and savings accounts and $80,000. And I thought, this is still my son. Whatever has happened between us, that has not changed. He was awake when I arrived. Heather was with him, and she looked so relieved to see me that something in my chest released a little. Scott looked at me from the hospital bed, pale, a little hollowed out, and I watched his face do something complicated, something that took a moment to resolve into what it actually was. He looked like the 9-year-old in the too big suit. He said, "Mom." Just that. Just my name, or my title, whichever you want to call it. I sat down next to the bed and I took his hand. We didn't talk about the wedding that day. We didn't talk about any of it. I sat with him until visiting hours ended, and then I sat in the hospital cafeteria until Heather came down and said he was sleeping, and she sat across from me and wrapped both hands around a paper coffee cup, and she said, "I think we've made some mistakes. I think I have." I looked at her. I said, "Heather, I love my son. That is the only thing I've ever been certain of in my adult life. Everything else we can figure out." She nodded. She was crying a little. She said, "I know you sold your apartment. I know what you did for us, and I don't think we handled it the right way." "No," I said, "you didn't." She nodded again. It wasn't instant after that. I want to be honest about that because stories that wrap up too neatly feel dishonest. And you've sat with me through this whole thing, so you deserve the truth. It was slow. There were months of careful dinners, of conversations that would almost tip into real honesty before one of us would pull back. There was a Sunday afternoon when Scott and I were doing dishes together at my apartment, and he said, without looking at me, I think I was ashamed, not of you, of me, of where I came from, and I took it out in a direction I shouldn't have. He said it flat, factual, like he'd been rehearsing it for a long time. I didn't say anything for a moment. I handed him a wet bowl to dry. Then I said, I know. I figured that out eventually. He said, I'm sorry, Mom. I said, I know that too. We don't talk about the housewarming party, or the reception seating, or the special dedication. Not directly, not as items on a list, but something underneath all of it has shifted. When he calls now, we stay on the phone long enough that one of us usually has to say, okay, I need to go make dinner. When I visit, he shows me things. Something he fixed in the yard, a book he's reading, a problem at work he's trying to think through. Small things. The kind of small things that are actually the whole of a relationship if you look at them honestly. Last spring, Heather had a baby, a girl. She called me from the hospital just a few hours after. Scott was in the background sounding like he hadn't slept and couldn't stop smiling. She said they'd been thinking about the middle name for a while. They'd been going back and forth. They named her Clara Marion. I held that for a long time after I hung up the phone. Clara Marion. I sat in my reading chair by the window with the petunias outside, and I sat with that name and what it meant. Not everything, not the erasing of every hard thing, but something. A marker, a declaration that I was here, that I had always been here, that I was worth putting into a name that a little girl would carry for the rest of her life. I have a picture of her on my phone that I've looked at probably 400 times. She is 8 months old in it, and she has Scott's serious expression, that same slight concentration between the brows, and she is wearing a yellow onesie and grabbing at something off camera with both fists. I spent so many years making myself smaller so that Scott would have room to grow. I don't regret the sacrifice. I want to be clear about that. What I regret is not understanding sooner that loving someone without tending to yourself is not love. It's disappearing. It's a slow vanishing act that ends with you standing on a patio you helped pay for, pressing your thumb into a table so you don't fall apart, wondering when exactly your presence in your own son's life became a footnote. I'm not a footnote anymore. Clara Marion makes sure of that every time I walk through the door. I've thought about what I would say at the end of the story for a long time. Not to wrap it up neatly. I don't think honest things wrap up neatly. But because I think there's something here worth sitting with. Something that took me years to understand, and that I wish someone had said to me when I was still in the middle of it. Here's what I know now. The way Scott treated me wasn't an accident. And neither was the fact that it went on as long as it did. I allowed it. Not consciously, not maliciously. I allowed it the way you allow a slow leak in a roof, because fixing it requires admitting the roof is damaged, and admitting that feels like failure. Every time I said, it's fine, when it wasn't. Every time I handed over my savings without a single conversation about what I needed in return. Every time I accepted a chin lift instead of a hug and told myself that was enough. I was teaching my son that I could be treated as optional. Children learn what we demonstrate, not what we say. I said I mattered. I demonstrated for years that I didn't. That is not a comfortable thing to admit. But I think it's an important one. What changed things wasn't the housewarming. It wasn't even what Scott said that evening, or the way he said it. What changed things was the moment I sat in my car in that parking lot and made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not a declaration or an ultimatum or a scene. Just a quiet, private decision that I was going to stop shrinking. That I was 61 years old, and I had a right to take up space in my own son's life. And if he couldn't offer that, I was going to stop pretending the absence didn't hurt. That decision, small, interior, made alone in a dark parking lot, is what eventually made room for everything that came after. Scott's hospital stay, Heather's honesty over a paper coffee cup, the long, slow thaw of those careful dinners. None of it could have happened if I had kept going the way I was going. Because the version of our relationship I had been maintaining wasn't a relationship. It was a performance of one. And performances, eventually, exhaust everyone involved. I'm not a person who believes in luck or fate, not in any formal way. What I do believe is that the things we do accumulate. The choices we make, to speak or to stay silent, to hold a line or dissolve it, to keep giving when the giving is hurting us, those choices compound over time. Scott grew up watching a woman who believed that love meant self-erasure. He learned that lesson well. When I finally stopped teaching it, something in the dynamic had to shift. It did. Slowly, imperfectly, but it did. Clara Marion is 11 months old as I finish telling you this. She doesn't know my name yet, not really, but she reaches for me when I come through the door. She grabs at my face with both hands and looks at me with that serious expression she inherited from her father, and she has not yet learned to make anyone feel like a footnote. I intend to keep it that way, for both of us.